Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this year's Solutions Summit. This is the transportation session. My name is Bob Pishu. I'm the Transportation Director at Washington Policy Center. And we'll just get started, and people will just come and trickle in and sit down as needed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the center and what we did last year, what we're looking forward to this year, and then we'll get to our main speakers. So last year really turned out a lot different than I thought it would. I ended up spending a lot of my time looking at one transit agency in particular. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it was definitely interesting. What happened here in King County was that King County Metro Transit went to the ballot, the April ballot, seeking two tax increases, a car tab fee increase and a sales tax increase to preserve bus service in King County. They said that if voters rejected the tax increases, they threatened to cut 17% of bus service throughout the county. But we found some things that really caught our attention. For one, Metro Transit was getting record sales tax revenue in 2014. But not only that, they were getting millions more than they thought they would get. So we provided numerous recommendations, scrubbed their budgets. We noted some other things that they could do, better work with labor unions to preserve bus service and keep bus service on the road, but without raising taxes. And voters rejected that 54% to 46% in King County. We kept pressing forward. We kept providing our recommendations, and ultimately, King County officials preserved 95% of bus service without raising regressive taxes on working families. So not only did the public get the information for voting, accurate information, but they also kept up the pressure to keep the neighborhood bus service that they value so much. So that was most of our 2014 focus, but as we go into 2015, there are kind of three things that we'll really be focusing on throughout the session. So one is the transportation budget and any transportation package that could come before lawmakers and possibly the public. Sound Transit is gearing up for large tax increases to expand light rail, and we'll have some more information as to the impact to working families, what supposed benefits they would receive from a light rail line that they might live 10 miles away from. And also a VMT tax. So some state officials, they want to shift away from the gas tax as a way to fund infrastructure projects. And what that is it would be a new tax, an entirely new tax based on the amount people drive. So those are the three main focuses of the center. I hope that you'll continue to read our research, and you can definitely contact me if you'd like any more information regarding those. So I want to introduce our first speaker, Senator Curtis King. He represents the citizens of Yakima and is chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. He also serves on the Commerce and Labor Committee and the Rules Committee. So please extend a warm welcome to Senator Curtis King.
Well, good morning. So we start session on Monday, and I don't know if any of us are really ready for that or not, but it's like life. It's going to be here whether we want it to be or not. But I would tell you that a lot of us have been working towards that day, and I'm really anxious to get there and see what we can get done. And I believe that if we sit down and work together, we can be out of there in the 105 days that we're supposed to be out of there with, and that we can do it in a manner that will address the problems, all of the problems, education and transportation, if we do it together and work together and try to be reasonable about it. I'm looking forward to working with Senator Hobbs, who is the ranking minority on transportation. I believe he and I have been working for the last part of the interim, even before he got that appointment, and we are currently in having talks about how do we move forward. Same is true of Representative Cliburn and Representative Orcutt over in the House, with Representative Cliburn obviously being the chair of transportation over there. The budget, transportation budget, I think will be relatively simple, pretty bare bones. We don't have a lot of revenue to play with. Just try to maintain where we've been, as we've done over the last 2 years. And so then the thing that everybody wants to talk about and we've been working on for 2 years is a transportation revenue package. So how do we move that forward, and why haven't we moved that forward? Well, I won't get into the why we haven't, because there's a lot of reasons for that. But I would tell you from our standpoint and my standpoint that as we look at a transportation revenue package, it needs to be focused. It's a limited amount of money. It's a lot of money, but it's still a limited amount of money. And so how are we going to use it? And I would say to you that the first thing we have to do is go after maintenance and preservation. The nickel package in 03 and the 9.5-cent package in 05 did little to nothing in regards to maintenance and preservation. There were no dollars there that amounted to anything. And so we've ignored that for 10 years now. We can't ignore it any longer. We need to focus on that. And we need to focus on solving the problems that we know we're facing as a transportation system. The operation and the capitalization of the ferry system, we need to solve that problem. We need to solve the problem in the shortfalls of operations of our state patrol, and make sure that our state patrolmen have a salary, have a wage that's competitive with all of the other agencies around the state. Now, you may say, well, you know, the policemen in Seattle just get paid too much. The reality is they get paid what they pay. They get paid. And we have to make sure that our state patrolmen are paid at a competitive level, or we're not going to be able to get them to come to work and be the quality of people that we want them to be. We need to give direct distribution to cities and counties. I believe that when we lost the MVET, the cities and counties were two of the hardest hit groups that were in the state. And we haven't helped them get back from that loss. And I think that needs to be addressed. And in a minute, I'll give you another reason as to why I think that money needs to go directly to cities and counties. When we look at, well, what do we do with this money? And what kind of projects are we going to pick? We need to pick projects that are of economic significance to the state of Washington. And I don't mean the project itself. So I'll give you an example. The 148-520 interchange. That's a $38 million project. But by improving that interchange, we will open up that area to $1 billion of economic development. That's with a B, $1 billion of economic development. Those are the kind of projects that we ought to be looking at when we start to look at how are we going to spend this money and what projects are we going to choose. And that's how we focused on this. And we focused on this all around the state. From Senator Erickson's area up in Whatcom County to Senator Hewitt's down in Walla Walla, across the state we've looked at projects. And you say, well, you know, we got all this need in King County. Yeah, you do. And we need to address that as well. But I can tell you a little project over in Liberty Lake outside of Spokane. It's a $45 million project. It's a huge economic driver for Liberty Lake. They have 25 million of that 45. Why doesn't it make sense then for us to put that into our package and say, let's give them that 20 million so they can do that and let them develop as well as everybody else around the state? That's what I mean by an economic driver and of economic significance. So and I want to emphasize, we got to take this limited amount of money and use it to address the problems that we have. And in my belief, bike and ped paths are not our problem. Transit is not our problem. Safe routes to school, complete streets, hey, they're all nice things. but they're not our problem. Let's take that money and address the problems that we have. All of those things to me are a local issue. Goes back to what I said. Let's put the money in the TIB, CRAB, FIMSIB, which is city, county, freight mobility, and let's give direct distribution to every city and every county, and then we say to them, here's the money, you, elected official, decide how you're going to use it. Not Olympia sitting up there in their ivory tower saying, oh, this $55 or $60 million has all got to go to transit. That should be a local decision. And that's what we need to do in this package, is try to move that money down so that those decisions are made locally. And if they decide that's where they want to use it, more power to them, because they have to be held accountable by the people that elected them. So they, I believe, are going to make the best decisions they can with that limited amount of money. So then you get to the things that has probably been the most challenging of putting a package together. And that's the reforms that we've asked for. So as you talk about reforms, I'm going to mention one of them that really isn't a problem, because I think we've came to agreement on now I'm going to forget the word, but permitting. And so when we look at culverts, most of you are probably aware that we've lost a lawsuit. We have 1,047 culverts that have to be addressed by 2030. So I go tour 3 of these. One of them's done, the other 2 weren't. And we're standing well, we weren't in the rain, but we were undercover. And we're standing there, and DOT says to us, it's going to take us 2 years. I said, okay, 2 years. Well, 2 years. No, it's going to take us on average 2 years for every one of those culverts before we can put a shovel in the ground. And they just said it like, well, you know, that's life. Well, how are you going to get 1,047 of these done if you got to wait 2 years on every one of them? And I said to him, do you not understand that we have a problem here? Does that not, well, we got the federal requirements, we got this. And I'm going, yeah, you may have them, but let's sit down and figure out how we're going to get around them, how we're going to get them so that we can do these things in 3 or 4 months instead of 6 months. So the one that we looked at that was done, took them almost 2 years to get to the point where they put a shovel in the ground. Took them 45 days to get the project done. So tell me it's going to take us 2 years to get to where we can address the problem, and then it's going to take us 30 to 60 days to get it done. Doesn't make a bit of sense to me. There is absolutely no common sense, because we're going to end up exactly where everybody wants to end up, whether it takes us 2 years or it takes us 60 days. So then we look at the sales tax on transportation projects, and we're saying the sales tax on those projects needs to come back to transportation. It's kind of logical. It's monies that have been paid by the people that buy our gas and diesel. It's still gas tax money. It's still protected by the 18th Amendment. It should come back to transportation. They say, oh, we can't do that. You're going to devastate our ability to pay for McClary and education. So we said, okay, we'll move it out beyond 2018 when we, by law and by statute, we have to have all that decided. Oh, I still can't do it. Just can't do it. We're talking about $30 million a year. You got a $3 or $4 billion problem a year, and you're telling me that $30 million is going to stop us from funding education? If that's the case, we really do have problems in the state of Washington. So we want to see that money come back, and I would point out quickly that we picked 4 projects. We picked 148th and 520, 124th and 520, SR 9, and I believe it's SR 524, and the Red Mountain interchange between Kiona-Benton and Richland. And we analyzed those, and we said, what is the economic growth after you finish those projects? It was $2.47 billion over 10 years. $2.47 billion. Now, that would give back to the state then, once that's done, and that development has taken place, over $200 million that go into the general fund. It also would generate more than $100 million in increased property taxes. And guess where that goes? That goes to education. Has to go to education. So that's 4 projects out of 56 that were in our last package. So if you take that and look at, we've picked projects that are economic significance. I'm telling you that if we do this right, we will return to the state 2, 3, maybe 4 times as much money as we're asking them to give up. It's kind of logical to me, but that always doesn't fly in Olympia. We tried to work with the environmentalists and say, give us a little of your MOTCA money and we'll address stormwater on legacy projects, old projects that have been completed where we didn't do enough or didn't do anything for stormwater. Oh, can't do that. No, it's got to come out of the back pocket of anybody that drives a car or truck that burns gas or diesel. That basically was their answer. You try to use the money the way it's supposed to be used, but no, you can't do that. They didn't like it. Oh, we like it better than your first proposal, but we don't like it. Can't do that. So then we get to prevailing wage, which is the third sticking point. And we're saying, well, we're talking about ST3 now. That's $9 billion, again with a B, dollars of construction. We're looking at a package that is going to put somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 billion, again with a B, over the next 12, 14 years. And you're saying labor can't help us with that? Who's going to build that $16 billion worth of projects? It's going to be labor. And so, you know, all we're saying is let's be reasonable about it. Labor's got to have some skin in this game. The environmentalists have to have some skin in this game. And I would tell you, up to this point, they've had little or none. So when we look at transit, and I'll close with this, we got to, you know, you look at what was talked about earlier, is that we've had Pierce County or Pierce Transit come out and say, oh, we've made 47% cuts, and if we don't get more money, we're going to make another 37%. And we said, well, go back, look at your sales tax. Look at what your sales tax revenues are doing. They're increasing. Oh, yeah, but that's not going to do it. And sales tax is too volatile, you know. It isn't going to solve our problem. No, I think it will. Well, before the end of session, it was like, oh, well, guess what? All of a sudden, Pierce Transit had enough money. They're good for the next 6 years. That's what they told us. The next 6 years. Metro, we said the same thing to them. You're not going to have to make 17% in cuts. Look at your sales tax revenue. They knew it, but they didn't want to admit it. I think that's the fact. They didn't want to admit it. And when you talk about the governor's proposal that we put money into operation of transit, if the state of Washington ever starts to fund the operation of transit in the state of Washington, it'll be a black hole that we will never, ever fill. I can guarantee you that. And when you look at some of the statistics that Mr. Scribner is going to give you here in a few minutes, and I hope you look at those statistics, you'll see what I mean. So with that, I will close. I could go on for a long time, but you've heard me flap my gums enough, and I know that Mr. Scribner has some very good things to bring to you, and I'll look forward to your questions at the end of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Up next, we have Mark Scribner. He's a fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on transportation, land use, and telecommunications policy. So please welcome Mark Scribner.
So I've got a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. see if I can figure this out. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. You have a beautiful state, and it's always good to leave the District of Criminals to talk about transportation policy. No. It's the one with the, it's got a white background. There we go. Okay. So I'm gonna begin by talking about sort of giving you an overview of sort of where highways and transit have been going over the past few decades nationwide. Then I'm going to talk about some artificial federal policy cost drivers to transportation projects. I'm going to give some thoughts on the forthcoming federal surface transportation reauthorization, which we expect to begin in the coming months. And then I'm going to close with some recommendations for the states as it relates to that federal policy. All right, oh, there it goes. Okay, so this is way too small, I realize, to see. But that top left chart right there, that shows the spending breakdown nationwide of surface transportation dollars. As you can see, maybe, about 25% comes from the federal government, 40% is coming from the states, and then 36% is coming from local governments. That bottom left chart shows the modal split between highways and transit of that spending. For both the feds and the states, transit gets about 20%, with the remainder going to highways. And then at the local level, that transit share jumps up to about 40%. Now, this table on the right, and where those two arrows are, which you definitely can't see, but the top arrow shows driving alone from 1980 to 2010 as a share of commuting trips, and that second one is transit share. Now, since going back 35 years since we saw governments begin spending a lot more money on mass transit, we've seen in 1980 the modal share for transit was over 6%, and now 2010 we saw that drop below 5%. So going back to those charts on the left, I think two major takeaways. One, we are spending 25% of total transportation dollars in the U.S. on a mode, mass transit, that accounts for about 5% of commuting trips. And this isn't a new thing. I think we're at a peak right now in terms of transit share of those dollars, but we've been seeing this trending upward for 30 years. So the goal to get people out of their cars, which has been the primary goal of spending more money on transit, has completely failed. The first artificial cost driver I'm going to talk about is the Davis-Bacon Act. This has a rather sordid, very sordid history. The primary purpose when this was enacted back in 1931 was to disadvantage African-American migrant workers who were moving from the Jim Crow South to the North for better opportunities. And the purpose was to prevent that new competition from taking jobs. So since then, what this really does is that it requires that federal contractors pay a local prevailing wage, as determined by the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. But given the presence, the near ubiquity of project labor agreements, what prevailing wage generally means is you are paying the union wage, which is a lot more than you'd be paying for the market wage. And what this does is it increases construction costs for transportation projects by about 10%. Second artificial cost driver is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, just turned 35 last week. So enacted in 1970, this was the first time that federal projects had to consider environmental impacts. They had to document that analysis, and then they had to give the public a chance to comment. So the environmentalists and the not in my backyard folks quickly figured out how to manipulate this project to slow or halt pretty much any project they really didn't like. And many, many good projects have been slowed down or even halted over the years. What this has done by 2011, we saw that the average environmental review for a major transit project, so even before we do anything, any groundbreaking before shovels hit dirt, we saw that it took 8 years, and that was up from 3.5 years in 2000. So this is a major, major cost. And I'll talk in a second. I'll talk about how Congress has attempted to address these out-of-control costs and project delays. But what this does is that it increases construction costs by 4 to 8%. But it doesn't end with NEPA, because the states have enacted mini NEPAs, such as Washington's State Environmental Policy Act. This adds further complexity to the project delivery process. And one really interesting thing, or terrible thing, about these mini NEPAs is that it completely changed the dynamics of project delivery. Previously, if you wanted to build a project, what you did is you would make sure that that met all the local codes, zoning, building, things like that. And then if it did, you pretty much go ahead. Now, even if you meet all of those local codes, you're still subject to this very onerous review process, and your project can be killed in that or delayed. And that's, I think, a major problem, the fact that we have this federal law and then these state laws all over the country that can vary quite a bit. Now, at the federal level, like I said, so 2015, Congress is looking to reauthorize the surface transportation law. The last time they did it was in 2012, and it really wasn't much of a reauthorization. It was really a long extension. So there is talk that we're going to see a long-term 5-6-year bill, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that. But sort of the situation, what we've seen over the last decade, is that the Federal Highway Trust Fund has been bailed out by over $50 billion. What that means is that about 10% of the disbursements that have been coming out of the Highway Trust Fund have been general revenue funds that have been moved into the trust fund. And this is simply why this exists, why this dynamic exists, is because Congress refuses to spend within their projected revenues. In fact, in the last reauthorization in 2012, there was a non-binding motion to instruct on the floor of the U.S. House, and all this said, and it wasn't binding, all it said was, we, the Congress, will not spend more money than we're projected to bring in. That got 82 votes. So another interesting aspect, thanks to this shift or rather the bailouts in recent years, is that the donor-donee state dynamic that many of you are aware of. This was particularly an issue in the 1990s when you saw states, including California, who were calling for the federal surface transportation programs to be completely devolved to the states. That no longer exists. Thanks to the bailouts, every single state is getting more money from the federal government than they send up in fuel tax revenue. But even before the bailouts, we saw that the federal role was stagnating, and I think you might be able to see in this chart here, that top line is state and local spending. That bottom line is federal spending, and you can see that gulf widening, really going back to the 1980s. And that was as they were sort of wrapping up the initial construction of the interstate highway system. So I think we can't count on the federal government to solve funding problems anymore. Things really are shifting to the states, and I'll get more specific in a moment. But as to the forthcoming federal reauthorization of the surface transportation law, I've got a few recommendations. Some are more likely to be included than others, but one, and this is a proposal that has been endorsed by the White House last year. It's to end the prohibition of states tolling their interstate highway segments for reconstruction purposes. We have, over the next 20 years, we're going to have about $600 billion in reconstruction costs for just the interstate system, and that doesn't include any widening in these choke points. That's just to maintain the current lane miles. I would recommend that we adhere to a strict user pays, user benefits principle. Users who are paying the gas tax, or if they're paying tolls, that revenue that's collected should go to projects that benefit them. It shouldn't be diverted into mass transit or bike trails or transportation museums, or whatever they decide to spend the money on. And part of that, I think, the really important part is ending the Highway Trust Fund bailouts, really just saying, we, the Congress, are not going to spend more money than we're projected to bring in. That, I think, is actually unlikely to occur in this reauthorization, as sad as that sounds. Another thing I would recommend is ending these so-called competitive grants programs, such as Tiger, New Starts, and Small Starts. These programs, while they're a very small share of total federal spending, have enabled some of the worst waste that we've seen in recent years. A lot of the streetcar projects that we've seen popping up across the country have been funded in large part due to these so-called competitive grants programs. So I would recommend getting rid of these and going back to the so-called dumb formula funding that traditionally and continues to characterize most federal spending. But really, we should get rid of these highly politicized grants programs because they seem to fund a lot of transportation projects that may have made sense in the 1880s, but they don't make sense now. And then turning back to NEPA, I really think we should continue the reforms that we saw in the last reauthorization, the MAP 21 law, and particularly expanding these mandated categorical exclusions to more project types. A big thing that they did in the last reauthorization that was very positive, although, you know, I think it'll take probably another 5 years to see how effective this is. But you know, if you wanted to, it basically exempted from NEPA requirements that operational right-of-ways. So if you want to add a hot lane or something like that, you don't need to go through this this crazy, lengthy NEPA process. And I think there's a lot more to do expanding these CEs to other project types. So what does all this mean for the states? I like to say we're in, you know, we haven't devolved the federal role to the states, but we're in a sort of the land of de facto devolution. We can't count on, I think it's no one, we're not going to see a federal gas tax increase, even though you've seen in recent days some Republicans signal that they're open to that. Problem with that is that right after the Republicans take both chambers, I find it highly unlikely that they would move to the left of President Obama on the gas tax issue. So they may say that all options are on the table, but I don't think we're going to see a federal gas tax increase. With this federal share, we can expect the share of expenditures to continue to decline. And states really are starting to take a lead, a bigger role in transportation project delivery. And I think this is a really good thing. States really know what their needs are, much more than some bureaucrat or congressional staffer in DC. So I think this is a good thing, but this presents opportunities as well as challenges. So the opportunities, this allows for more experimentation at the state level. But this also means states are going to be held much more accountable to their project decisions. So states really are up to this challenge, I think, though, provided we do things, we empower them by doing things like allowing them to toll for interstate reconstruction and really let them experiment with some of the more innovative funding and financing and management practices, such as public-private partnerships. I think this can do a lot, and especially since we're going to see a new generation of transportation technology come online in the coming decade, that of autonomous vehicles. And I think states, rather than the feds, are in the best position to get ready for that. So I guess I'm going to close. I've sort of alluded to this, but I really want to emphasize this. So with this greater autonomy definitely comes greater responsibility. State policymakers, local policymakers are going to be held more accountable by their constituents for their transportation decisions. They're not going to, given that the federal gravy train is coming to an end, projects like streetcars, these low-value, high-cost projects, they're not going to be able to look and say, you know, this is free money, we should just do this, and then be on the hook for a generation of operating subsidies. So with that, I'm going to end, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to open up with a question first, and then we'll get some questions from the audience. Well, here and especially in the Puget Sound region, I think Mark hit on a point that we know all too well here, is that most of the transportation revenues go to transit. Here in the Puget Sound region, about 60% of transportation-related money from the feds or local funds is spent on transit, and about 40% goes to roads. And even with the road projects going on here, you know, the most notable ones, the 520 bridge, there's no new general capacity being added to that bridge yet. It costs $4.5 billion. The Alaskan Way Viaduct Tunnel is at least $3 billion. Who knows what that is, but it's going from a 6-lane viaduct to a 4-lane tunnel. And the center lanes of Interstate 90 are being given to Sound Transit for light rail. So in this region, we're getting less and less capacity. So how important is ending those diversions and prioritizing congestion relief and the moving of traffic flows as opposed to light rail and things like that?
I think that's crucial. You know, this has been a problem for decades now. You know, we're not adding lane miles in the U.S. anymore. That really stagnated in the 1980s, even though we've seen a large population increase and a large vehicle miles travel increase. So we really do need to focus on projects that can actually deliver value. And yeah, focusing on congestion that costs the U.S. economy in wasted time and fuel over $100 billion annually, and that's just commuting. You're not taking into account freight. So I think that's crucial. These transit projects, particularly if you're building things like streetcars, run as fast as you can and make sure that money is going to roads, and it's going to benefit the people who are actually paying those taxes and fees, which are the drivers.
Well, I agree. I mean, if you look at, we haven't added any capacity on the 520. If anything, we've lessened that capacity. Then you take the Mercer Island Bridge, and we've given away, you know, 2 of the express lanes, and they keep saying, well, you know, we'll get 2 more lanes when that happens, and you know, we'll make them narrower, and so, you know. Well, yeah, but when they add that lane, guess what? It's going to be an HOV lane. So, you know, unless you have 2 or 3 people in your car, it isn't going to do you any good. They don't want to address congestion. One of our reforms, which pretty much has been agreed to, is now congestion is part of the transportation plan, that we have to address congestion. That wasn't even one of the 6 elements of our plan. Tell me how that makes any sense. And then tell me, when you talk about congestion and why we need more buses and more of these things, when you look at the city of Seattle, I'll give you one example. You have the Amazon building a new tower. And a month or 6 weeks ago, I heard they want to build 2 more right beside them. So they're going to build 3 towers. And the city of Seattle's going, oh, hey, this is great. We get the revenue, we want them built, yeah, let's do it. Those 3 towers will house 44,000 people. Now, because Seattle said, hey, we'll let you build those towers down here in our community, is that a state problem? I don't think so. But they want to say, well, we're going to build these towers. Now, state, you help us get those people to work. No, it's not our problem. It's your problem, City of Seattle, because you allowed them to do it. And then you add the biomedical center that is going to be built on the east side of Lake Union. You add Weyerhaeuser moving down to Pioneer Square, and I can probably find 15 or 20 others. Seattle doesn't want cars or trucks down there, but they're willing to let everybody else come down, and then it's the state's problem to get there. I don't think so. So anyway.
Thank you both. Okay, we'll take some questions from the audience. We'll go front to back, you 3. So we'll start up here with you. We have a microphone coming, so.
Thank you. I have heard what appears to be a very shocking assertion from a state representative who said that if you take all of the federal, local, and state taxes that are collected in the state of Washington, that over half of that money is spent on public transit, and that only 4% of the population uses public transit. Now, I don't know if this is accurate or if I misunderstood what he said or whether he misspoke, so I won't identify him. But I'd like to know if anybody could address that and answer whether that's even remotely close to being the truth, because if it is certainly shocking. Thank you.
Well, I believe I'm correct in saying that the amount of revenue taken in by all of the transit agencies in the state of Washington is something like $2.2 billion a year. All of the money that is brought into the state from gas tax is about $1 billion. So transit's taken in twice as much as what we collect in gas tax. That may be part of what you're talking about. So you have all of these transit agencies providing 5%, if we're generous, of the trips, and they're getting twice as much money as the state's taken in gas tax.
Thank you. Vic?
Senator King, given that light rail provided by Sound Transit carries less than 1/4% of the trips in the region, and Sound Transit receives 1/3 of the total revenue received within the four-county region of the PSRC, do you think it's appropriate to hold the transportation package in the legislature hostage to Sound Transit's $15 billion request?
We have a slight problem with this microphone, and maybe it's just me, but, well, you know, I think that's going to be one of the elements that's going to be used in our discussions as we move forward. You know, I know that in '96 or '97, when Sound Transit came out with their, I think it was called Central Line, and I'm no expert on this, their projections were that by 2010, they would have 107,000 riders a day. So 2010 came, 2010 left, 2014, 2013 was here. In beginning of 2014, they hadn't reached 30,000 riders a day. And we asked the question, well, where's all that additional money coming from that, you know, supposedly these what, 70,000 riders that are supposed to be paying every day, who's making up that deficit? Because it's going to cost you the same to make those runs whether you got 107,000 or whether you have 30,000. And, you know, it's because the area has agreed to pay, you know, I believe, in sales tax and other forms. You know, their money's coming in, and that's why they've been able to build up the amount of money they've had in their surplus accounts. And so to say, well, now we're going to give them another $9 billion because some of these bonds are being paid off, and they'll have another $6 billion to put with it. I mean, that's a decision that has to be made locally. And I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me, but the voters voted for it, and the voters need to hold them accountable. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, and I just want to expand on that just a little bit. You know, so right now, Sound Transit's plans, they have experienced a decade of delay and nearly double in cost overruns. So as you know, they have yet to finish their first segment, but yet they're going for the tax increases for the third segment. So that doesn't even include the second segment that voters have already voted on. So that's just an interesting, and I kind of want to bring that around to Mark. Is that typical? You know, are these cost overruns, lower than expected ridership? Are those? Is that typical of light rail systems in the United States? You know, and other places?
Yeah, this is a nationwide phenomenon. The goal of transit, now they're even moving away from trying to achieve ridership goals and getting people out of cars, and they're talking about things like, well, we're going to do economic development around this. So, they're not even, they've basically, the transit boosters have started seeding to us that transit is generally terrible at moving people at a very high cost, and now they're saying all these other things that are completely unrelated to mobility, this is why we should do transit. But yeah, the cost overruns and dismal ridership figures that's a nationwide thing.
Thank you. Hank, I think you had your hand up.
I've spent 40 years in management and transportation economics in a variety of different issues, and I think one of the things that a lot of transportation people or people who want to talk about transportation don't realize is that transportation is an ancillary activity. People don't get in their cars, climb on a bus, get on a train, jump on an airplane or a ferry unless they have some reason to do it. It's not an entertainment mode, it's not a recreational activity. And so when you push the balloon in any sort of different fashion, there are effects elsewhere. And I think a lot of people don't understand that if you try to force a transportation industry to go a particular way, there are deeper underlying effects that are going to take place because the transportation is really a support activity. And I'm hoping that Senator King and others will take that message forward, because we're hearing a lot of plans on how we alter our lives without understanding that the transportation end of the lever is really the small end.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I think, sir, yeah, right next to you. I think he had his hand up earlier.
You briefly mentioned public-private partnerships. Could you expand on that a little bit in terms of potential impact, the likelihood of execution, given our ability of resource constraints in delivering projects, and specifically on how they might affect the selection of projects and the economic benefits?
Yeah, I don't think P3s are a silver bullet. I think there's a role for them, but in an era where we do face funding constraints, I think particularly, when I'm talking about P3s, public-private partnerships, I'm not talking about merely design build. I'm really talking about design build, finance and operate, long-term concessions, where you can tap into the private capital markets and really basically shift that risk from the taxpayer to these investors. I think that's an important thing that's often missed in the P3 discussion. We're not doing this for the sake of involving the private sector just because it's the private sector. There need to be benefits to taxpayers, and we actually need to get value out of this. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Okay. Yeah, back there.
Right there, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no.
There you go.
Hi, question for Senator King. The governor's carbon fee program. Tell me if I'm missing something, but it seems to me like on the pollution side of it, we're going to charge them more because we want them to reduce the pollution that they're generating. And if we're successful at doing that, I question where would the carbon fee revenue come from if they stop polluting? They wouldn't be paying for that anymore. Yet the governor says we're going to get all of this revenue to pay for all these highway projects. Am I missing something there? And then also, do you think that that has any chance of being included in a new state transportation budget?
That's the problem. You look at where he wants to spend the money that he says is going to transportation. They call it transportation, but when you look at where he wants to spend it, it's not in roads and highways. So I think you're right. I mean, and to think that we're going to say, well, we're going to charge the refiners that produce the gas and the diesel, we're going to charge them because they're the polluters. That's really not true. We're the polluters. according to the governor. We're the big bad polluters, because cars and trucks generate over 50% of the carbon that goes into our air, even though our air is the 8th greatest quality in the state, and that we're 0.3% in the world economy, or the world environment. You could wipe Washington State off the map, it wouldn't make a tinker's ding, where, you know, nobody would even notice. But yet we're going to spend billions of dollars, we're going to put at risk our economy and the livelihood of the citizens of the state of Washington because we want to be pure. And now it's a moral issue. This is what really gets me going. It's a moral issue. You know, and so what does that say if you don't agree? I know what it says to me, and I don't believe I am that way. There are ways that we can address our carbon pollution. I've addressed those in an op-ed that was in the Seattle Times. There are ways we can do this, and we can do it together, and it's reasonable, and it's fair, and it makes sense. His proposal wants to punish us. That's what it's all about. And my example would be, he wants to extend the sales tax exemption for electric vehicles. All well and good. So if you buy a Tesla for $80,000, you don't have to pay any sales tax. Well, where does that come out of? It comes out of the general fund, because that's where that money would go. But in his proposal, he says, oh, I want to extend that. But guess what? The transportation budget's going to have to pay for it and make it up to the general fund. That's punishment. We can incentivize people to do things that would be beneficial. He also ignores the fact that our gas mileage per vehicle is going up, is mandated by the feds. It's supposed to be 54 miles per gallon in 2025. We're currently at about 24, and I'm not sure that I believe that number. I think it's lower, but 24 is the number I was given. So by 2025, we're going to have to be twice as good as we are now. Well, if we're more than 50% and we're twice as good as we are now, that's a 25% reduction in the next 10 years in the carbon we're putting into the air without doing a darn thing, because it's the car manufacturers going to have to meet that requirement. You don't hear a word about that.
And I would just add to that, whenever we're talking about raising fuel taxes or penalizing people, doing sort of taxing negative externalities like carbon and things like that, this is horrible for equity. So, I mean, the poor people tend to drive older, less fuel-efficient vehicles. So the burden of the fuel taxes is going to continue shifting onto them. So, you know, they frame this as a moral issue, but if you're really just soaking the poor, which is what these policies do, you're not achieving at least some moral aim that they often claim to be seeking. So I think that's an important point to consider, that this generally runs counter to equity.
Okay, I've got time for 2 more 1-minute questions. I've got 2 minutes. So, John, I think you had your hand up a lot earlier. So, all the way up front, up here in the.
Is there any chance that we can completely do a whoops? Remember the disaster that many years ago, the whoops were when they canceled the nuclear energy thing. Can that happen to Sound Transit? They're not doing a thing. They're using 1890 technology, which was more advanced and profitable, and they are so far back. And you know, is there anything that can be done to defund them completely, get rid of them?
I don't see that happening in the legislature, but you know, there are a lot of people that live in the area that they serve, and it would seem to me that if a case could be made that was there, which I'm not arguing that it isn't there, that somebody's going to have to take the initiative and say, hey, enough is enough. How much of this do we need? And I agree with you. It's like nobody's holding them accountable. But
Unfortunately, I don't think we can just start ripping up tracks for rail transit across the country. But one thing that I think is possible is to really shift towards fix it first. Right now, transit agencies across the country have an $80 billion maintenance backlog that they don't know how to deal with. This is only growing larger. And you know, a number of these systems which began in the 1970s are going to need to be completely reconstructed in the coming years. So right now, I think shifting towards fix it first, don't build another centimeter of new rail transit, perhaps, I mean, excluding maybe Manhattan, but you know, these light rail projects, streetcar projects, there's no justification for them. So while, you know, I don't think we're going to be able to be ripping up tracks anytime soon, we can at least, you know, stop the problem from getting worse.
Okay, and then a quick question from Will over there.
Senator King, currently in the statute, there's no mechanism for Sound Transit taxpayers to do anything about Sound Transit.
I'll repeat it. Go ahead if you wanted to keep going.
Currently, in the statute, there is no mechanism for Sound Transit taxpayers to have any kind of control over Sound Transit once they've approved the money. When Sound Transit promises 107,000 riders by 2010 and delivers 30 by 2014, would you support a mechanism in the statute that would allow a revote by Sound Transit taxpayers about the existing taxes? And furthermore, would you be supportive of the concept that Representative Carlisle has for sunsetting of taxes, so that without a revote on local option taxes, that they would go away after 10 years or 15 years or some other years, so as to create some actual control over these out-of-control agencies?
Well, it's easy to say. We had a proposal that would have looked at Sound Transit's administration, the system that they have for administration and their board. And we tried to get that changed. It was either last year or the year before in the legislature. It went absolutely nowhere. I mean, it wasn't going to happen. And I would say to you, no matter what we tried to do, it's not going to happen in the legislature. I think you're going to have to get the citizens, again, in the Sound Transit area to stand up and say enough is enough. I can't believe that there isn't a mechanism available within the statutes in the state of Washington that would allow us to repeal that or change it or alter it. But we'll be glad to have that conversation.
Okay, so please, thank you, Senator. Please join me in thanking Mark Scribner and Senator King. Our next session, oh, sorry.